Hello friends, today I'll be talking about a trend that many of us have noticed with carbon fiber paddle surfaces. Despite the commonly held belief that these paddles don't lose their high spin potential, spin testing reveals that they actually do lose significant amounts of spin over time. I first noticed spin loss from my Joola Ben John's Hyperion CFS paddle. After 3 months of playing with it, I felt like there was a big drop-off in terms of its spin. And when I tested the spin on the paddle, it came in at just above 1,300 RPM. That was surprisingly low since this paddle has notoriously high spin. So I borrowed a friend's brand new Joola Hyperion CFS, spin tested it, and got a result of 1,725 RPM. That's 400 RPM greater than my 3-month-old paddle. Then I tested a friend's new Joola Solaire paddle, which uses the same carbon friction surface that the Hyperion uses, and that came in at over 1,900 RPM. So that's a difference of 500 RPM between a new paddle with the same carbon friction surface and my 3-month-old paddle. So as I suspected, my paddle had lost a lot of spin over the course of just 3 months. Not coincidentally, Chris Olsen at the Pickleball studio also noticed the same thing for his Joola Ben John's paddle.
My Ben John's Hyperion went from almost 1,600 RPM when it was new, and my used one that I'm still using right now dropped to about 12 to 1,300 RPM.
Wow, that's a huge dip.
That's a really steep dip.
And as a side note, I hear a lot of people claiming that you have to clean carbon fiber surfaces because dust accumulates between the fibers and it reduces spin. I tested the spin before and after cleaning on this paddle, and I tried different cleaning methods, such as using just water or using Windex, using a toothbrush versus a microfiber cloth, and I can tell you that cleaning made absolutely no difference on the spin of my paddle. If you want to see more about how I spin tested these paddles, I'll link to my previous video below in the description. Basically, I borrowed Chris Olsen's method, which involves counting video frames during a ball's revolution to calculate the RPM. So a lot of paddles use carbon fiber, but the ones that have become very popular over the past year for their spin use raw carbon weaved fabric on the paddle face. To make this weaved fabric, carbon fiber manufacturers bundle together a bunch of microscopic carbon filaments into what's called a toe. And these toes are basically threads that are woven together in an over-under pattern to create this fabric. Under a microscope, this carbon fabric looks very much like a basket weave. It's the texture of this weave that grabs the ball and imparts spin. Currently, I know of 6 paddle companies that use this type of raw carbon fabric. So there's Carbon, Electrum, Engage, Joola, Gearbox, and Diadem. Other companies do use carbon fiber in their paddles, but not the fabric weave that has become so popular for its spin. So why did my Joola Hyperion lose its spin so quickly? I can understand why paddles with applied grit like the Franklin Signature paddle lose their spin because the applied grit wears off. But does the carbon fiber fabric weave wear off of the Hyperion paddles? I can't see anything just by looking at the paddle, although it does feel noticeably smoother in the center of the paddle near the sweet spot than it does around the edges. So I took a look at the paddle surface under a microscope. I chose 3 of my paddles with a carbon fabric surface and viewed all of them with a transect across the paddle from edge to edge centered on the sweet spot. So we're starting with the carbon 1 paddle. Starting at the edge of the paddle, you can see that the carbon fabric has this kind of plain over-under weave, very similar to the side of a basket. You can see that this provides plenty of texture to grab that ball and spin it. All right, moving toward the center of the paddle, you can start seeing some very slight wear right here. It's a little bit of separation of the fiber toes. So right here I'm using a sewing needle as a pointer. And you can just see, again, this slight separation. It's not much damage, but something to be noted. All right, moving toward the center of the paddle, this still looks very good. The texture is about the same as it was around the edges. And then on the opposite edge of the paddle, the fabric still looks really pristine. There's no damage. There's lots of texture. All right, moving on to the Electrum Model E paddle. The carbon fabric at the edge of the paddle looks almost identical to the carbon paddle. There's the same weave, this nice texture. And moving toward the center, you can start to see some minor damage. Again, it's just the separation between the carbon fiber toes. Now we're right in the center, and there's more of the same slight damage and separation of the toes. And now at the opposite edge, the fabric looks newer, less damaged, and has more texture. And finally, the Joola Hyperion CFS paddle. You can see at the edge, the fabric looks very similar to the Electrum and the carbon paddles. It's the same weave, the same texture. But as we're moving towards the center, you can see that the weave starts looking smashed and flattened with less texture. And then we start seeing our first damage here that I'm focusing on. And this damage is more like a tear in the fabric rather than just separation of the toes. And as we're moving on, the fabric looks more and more flattened and degraded. There starts to become very little texture here to grab the ball. And still you see this tearing. There's more linear tearing here. Now we're right in the center of the paddle. And this area looks really bad. The toes are completely smashed. They're fraying. And these tears are developing into holes, basically. All right, moving on to the opposite edge. There's still some damage, but the weaves are starting to look a little more intact here. And at the very edge, the fabric looks much newer and has that texture that we need to spin the ball. So all three of the paddles I tested showed microscopic damage to the carbon weave. And more damage basically equals less spin. What seems to be happening is that the fiber weave becomes flattened and damaged over time, resulting in less texture to grab the ball and impart spin. The Carbon 1 paddle had the least damage, and its spin was tested at over 1900 RPM. The Electrum Model E had a little more damage than the Carbon, and its spin tested at 1575 RPM. Lastly, the Joola Hyperion had the most damage, and its spin was the lowest at 1333 RPM. It's also not a coincidence that the amount of damage on these paddles is a result of how long I use them. I only used the Carbon 1 paddle for about a week because literally a week after I bought it was when the USA Pickleball controversy happened and they banned the paddle for having too much texture. I used the Electrum paddle for about 6 weeks, and I used the Joola Hyperion for 3 months solid. So we seem to get a steady decline in spin as paddles are used for longer periods of time. But these three paddle brands didn't all start with the same spin. In general, new Carbon and Joola paddles get a little more spin than Electrum, which begs the question, does the Joola carbon fabric wear down quicker than other brands? One thing to note is that there are many different manufacturers of carbon fiber and many different types of carbon fiber weave. It's entirely possible that some manufacturers produce just better carbon fiber, and some types of weaves are more durable. For example, carbon weaves are rated based on how many thousands of carbon filaments are used to create each fiber, and these fibers are technically called toes. So 3K carbon fiber has 3,000 filaments per toe, 6K has 6,000 filaments, etc. But as toe ratings go up, so do the size of the toes, meaning that at some point the fibers in the carbon fabric will become too big and the paddle surface would fail stare-at testing because of too much texture. All of the paddle manufacturers seem to have landed on 3K carbon fiber, which probably is the largest thread size that legally falls within those limits. So bear with me as I get into even more details about carbon fiber. But in addition to toe ratings, carbon fiber also has different compositions based on the carbon content of the fibers. So carbon fibers come in different types, such as T300, T700, and T800, based on the purity of the carbon filaments, and also based on different spinning processes that are used to bind the weave. So these types have different tensile strengths, and a tensile strength basically refers to the maximum amount of stress that any material can tolerate before it breaks. So the higher numbers within these types aren't necessarily better for paddle surfaces. For example, T800 is stiffer and more brittle than T700, so presumably T800 would break a little easier or damage easier when it's hitting this hard plastic pickleball. Both Electrum and Carbon advertise the use of T700 carbon fiber for their paddles, and Electrum actually takes it a step further and names their manufacturer, which is Toray. Now, Toray is a leading supplier of carbon fiber who are based in Japan, and they're known to provide some of the highest quality carbon fiber. I couldn't find the source of carbon fiber for any of the other paddle manufacturers, but I did get a response from Joola Technical Support, who sent me some paddle statistics, but they were not able to answer which type of carbon fiber they use or the manufacturer. So it's very, very likely to me that different paddle manufacturers will be using different types of carbon fiber and different types of carbon fiber manufacturers, which means that there will probably be different attrition rates between paddles, which is to say that some paddle manufacturers and some paddles will have spin that lasts longer than others. Right now, I can say that personally, I get about 3 months of play with a Joola Hyperion CFS before I have to replace it because the spin gets too low. Now, clearly, different people have different styles of play, and there are probably many, many people out there who would get a lot longer use life out of a Joola Hyperion CFS paddle than I do. I do have a hunch that Electrum paddles probably have a little longer spin life than other paddle brands. And the reason I say that is because they actually advertise who their manufacturer is. But again, that's just a hunch. So all of this is to say that carbon fiber fabric surfaces don't last forever. They do wear down over time and they lose their spin. Still, I believe that carbon fiber fabric is the best option we have right now to produce the most spin with the greatest durability. So I've already talked about the applied grit issue, and every other paddle I've tested that uses applied grit loses its spin far more quickly than carbon fabric. So I'll give you a little spoiler for my next video. I thought that Selkirk had cracked the code with their new Vanguard Power Air line using a grit that applied both the highest spin of all paddles and one that didn't wear off very quickly. The first part of that is in fact true. So I tested a couple of the Power Air paddles and both produced spin RPM over 2,000, which is insanely high. I mean, the balls literally whistle from the spin alone. But the second part of that, the paddle's spin durability, did not meet my hopes and expectations. Not even close. After 1 month of using the Power Air, the grit in the center of the paddle had entirely worn off and the spin RPM dropped by nearly 1,000. So that paddle went from being the absolute top of the list in terms of spin RPM down to next to last. That's not to say that this is a bad paddle, but if you're using this paddle for spin alone, there might be an issue. So be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so that you can see my next video when I review the Selkirk Power Air.